Some choices? They don't just disappear. Some moments? They stick to you, like shadows that follow you no matter how fast you run. And trust me, I've tried to run. It's been 2 years. 2 whole years since that night. Since that decision. Since my younger brother asked me for something so simple, so harmless. And yet, somehow, that one request cracked open something inside me, something I never even knew was there. I still remember it like it was yesterday. The way my stomach twisted in knots. The way my hands trembled just the slightest bit. The way my heart pounded so loud, I was sure he could hear it. But the worst part? The worst part wasn't what happened. It wasn't even what I felt in that moment. The worst part was realizing that I didn't stop it. That I didn't want to stop it. I tell myself that I was just lonely. That I was just looking for comfort. That it wasn't my fault. But when I close my eyes at night, I know the truth. I made a choice. A choice I can never take back. A choice that still haunts me every time I look at him. And maybe, just maybe, a part of me doesn't regret it. You ever done something you knew was wrong, but you did it anyway? Not because you wanted to hurt anyone, not because you planned to, but because, in that moment, it felt right? I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who crossed that line. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who let herself slip, who let herself feel things she wasn't supposed to feel. But life has a funny way of making you question who you really are. I used to think I was strong. That I had control over myself, over my emotions. That I could draw the line and never, ever cross it. Until I did. And now, I have to live with the weight of what happened. With the secrets I keep. With the way my heart races whenever I see my younger brother. Does he feel it too? Does he think about that night the way I do? Or is it just me, trapped in this endless loop of guilt and longing? Maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll judge me. Maybe you'll think I'm the worst person in the world. And maybe you're right. But before you decide, you need to hear the whole story. You need to understand how it happened. Why it happened. And what happened after. But first, before we dive in, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt something you weren't supposed to? Where a single moment made you question everything about yourself? If you have, tell me in the comments. I need to know, am I the only one? And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because trust me this is just the beginning. Now, let me tell you how it all started. It's strange how a life can look so perfect from the outside. If you had seen us, my husband and me, you'd think we had it all. A nice home, stability, years of marriage under our belt. People used to tell me how lucky I was to have a husband like him. Dependable, hardworking, a good provider. And I believed them. I really did. But what people never saw, what I barely let myself see, was the emptiness that had settled in between us, like a silent guest at the dinner table. You see, when we first got married, it wasn't like this. There was passion. There was laughter. He used to look at me like I was the only woman in the world. But over time, life happened. Work happened. Stress happened. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being his wife and became his responsibility. The little things faded first. The way he used to reach for my hand without thinking. The way his eyes would light up when I walked into the room. The way he'd pull me close at night, just because he wanted to feel me near. Now, I was just there. A fixture in the house. A partner in routine. A woman he shared a bed with but hadn't touched in. I don't even remember how long. And I told myself it was normal. That this is just what happens after years of marriage. That love settles, cools, becomes something different. Something quieter. But deep down, I knew better. Because a woman knows when she's no longer wanted. And the worst part? I didn't even blame him. I blamed myself. Maybe I had become boring. Predictable. Maybe I wasn't as exciting as I used to be. Maybe I was the problem. So, I buried it. I convinced myself I didn't need affection, that I didn't need to feel desired. I told myself I was strong enough to live without it. Until my younger brother came back home. He had been gone for years. Off studying, traveling, living his life. We had always been close growing up. He was the baby of the family, full of energy, always following me around, always looking up to me. But when he walked through our front door after all that time, he wasn't that little boy anymore. He was a man now. And it shocked me. I don't know why. I knew he had grown up, obviously. I had seen pictures, had talked to him on the phone. But seeing him in person? Seeing how he carried himself now? How his voice had deepened, how his once boyish face had sharpened into something more defined, more confident? It threw me. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first moment something inside me stirred. But I pushed it down. Of course I did. He was my brother. My baby brother. And yet, from the moment he arrived, there was something different about him. Or maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, really looked at me. Not with indifference. Not with the glazed-over disinterest I had grown used to from my husband. But with something else. Something warm. And God, I had forgotten what that felt like. The house changed the moment he moved in. It had been so quiet before. Too quiet. Most days, my husband worked late. He came home exhausted, barely speaking, barely noticing me as he ate, showered, and collapsed into bed. I had gotten used to that silence, that absence, even when he was physically present. But my brother? He filled the house with life again. He talked. He laughed. He asked questions about my day, my thoughts, my dreams. He noticed things. Things I didn't even realize I needed to be noticed. The way I hummed while cooking. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was deep in thought. The way I sighed, really sighed, when I thought no one was paying attention. He saw me. And I felt like I could breathe again. At first, I chalked it up to nostalgia. Of course, I enjoyed having him around. He was family. But then, little things started happening. Things I couldn't ignore. Like the way I found myself looking forward to him coming home. Or the way I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Or the way his compliments felt different. Not in what he said, but in how he said it. The softness in his voice when he told me I looked beautiful. The slight hesitation, like he was realizing, in real time, that he shouldn't have said it out loud. And I should have shut it down. Right then and there. But I didn't. Because somewhere deep inside me, buried beneath years of neglect, of loneliness, of longing, I liked it. I liked the way he made me feel. Like I was still someone worth looking at. Like I was still someone worth wanting. And that was dangerous. I remember one night, my husband was working late again. I had made dinner, set the table, waited for him, just like I always did. And just like always, he sent a short text saying, "Don't wait up." I stared at those words for a long time. Not surprised. Not even disappointed anymore. Just numb. And then, my brother walked into the kitchen, took one look at me, and said, "Let's go out." It was so simple. So casual. And yet, I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to go, but because something inside me knew this wasn't just a normal dinner between siblings. It felt like something else. And maybe, in that moment, I should have said no. But I didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, someone wanted to spend time with me. Someone chose me. And I was too starved for affection to say no. So, I got up, grabbed my coat, and followed him out the door. And that was the beginning of everything. Looking back now, I wonder, was it inevitable? Was there always something there, waiting for the right moment to surface? Or was it just me, so desperate to feel alive again that I let myself slip? Maybe it doesn't matter. Because the truth is, once that night happened, once I stepped into that moment with him, there was no turning back. Not for me. Not for him. And certainly, not for what happened next. Do you want to know what happened after that? Then keep watching. Because this story? It's only just getting started. That night, that simple night when I walked out of my house and into his car, I had no idea what I was setting in motion. I told myself it was nothing. That it was just dinner. Just a way to get out of the house, to escape the weight of silence that had become my life. But deep down, I think I knew. I think I felt it the moment he looked at me from across the table. The way his eyes lingered, not in a way that was obvious, not in a way that screamed anything inappropriate, but in a way that felt nothing spoken, but it was there. An unspoken understanding, A quiet awareness. We were careful. Careful not to touch too much. Careful not to let our eyes linger for too long. But the more we tried to ignore it, the more it grew. And then, he asked me. A simple request. So innocent, so harmless, I almost laughed at how ridiculous my hesitation felt. Come with me for the weekend. That's all he said. He had some work thing, something he needed to attend in another city, and he didn't want to go alone. He asked me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like it made perfect sense for me to be the one to go with him. And maybe, if things had been different, if I had been different, I would have said no. But I didn't. Because deep down, I wanted to go. I wanted to be the one he asked. I wanted to feel chosen. And so, I agreed. The drive there was easy, effortless. Music playing low in the background. The windows cracked open just enough for the cool evening air to slip in. And for a while, it felt safe. Like we were just two people, enjoying a road trip. Like there wasn't anything wrong. But then he started talking about our childhood. About memories I had forgotten, moments I hadn't thought about in years. Do you remember how I used to follow you everywhere? He asked, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I laughed, nodding. You were my little shadow. I still remember how you used to read to me at night, he said. Even when you didn't want to. Even when you had other things to do, you always made time for me. I felt something tighten in my chest. Because I had forgotten that. I had forgotten how much he used to rely on me, how much he used to look up to me, how much I had mattered to him. You were always there for me, he said, his voice softer now. Even when no one else was. And then, before I could stop myself, before I could remind myself that this was just a trip, just a favor, I reached over and touched his hand. It was supposed to be comforting. A sibling's touch. Nothing more. But the moment my fingers brushed against his skin, something passed between us. Something silent. Something heavy. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt afraid. I pulled my hand away too quickly, clearing my throat, forcing a laugh. Well, someone had to take care of you. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes now. Something unreadable. And I knew in that moment, that this was dangerous. That this wasn't just in my head. That he felt it too. And yet, I didn't stop it. I let the moment hang between us, thick and unspoken. I let myself wonder. And when we finally arrived at the hotel, when we stood outside our rooms, hesitating for just a second too long before saying goodnight, I let myself feel the weight of what was happening. And still, I did nothing to stop it. I told myself I was just tired. That the long drive, the memories, the nostalgia, it was all messing with my head. I told myself that after a night's sleep, everything would go back to normal. That I'd wake up and feel nothing. That this was all just a passing moment of weakness. But then, in the silence of my room, in the darkness of the unfamiliar hotel bed, I heard a knock at my door. Soft, hesitant. And I knew. I knew before I even got up. Before I even reached for the handle. I knew that this was the moment. The moment that would change everything. And yet, I opened the door anyway. I should have never opened that door. I knew it then. I know it now. But in that moment, in that quiet hotel room, standing just inches away from him, watching his expression shift between uncertainty and something else, something I wasn't ready to name, I wasn't thinking about right or wrong. I was thinking about how I felt. Wanted. Chosen. Alive. He didn't step inside. He just stood there, looking at me, and I looked back at him. And for a second, just a second, I let myself imagine what would happen if I reached out, if I closed the space between us. And that was enough to terrify me. So I did the only thing I could do. I forced a smile, pretended I didn't feel the weight of what was hanging between us, and I told him goodnight. And then I closed the door. But I didn't sleep that night. Because something had shifted. Something I couldn't take back. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. That I had imagined the way he looked at me. That I was just lonely. Just tired. Just desperate for affection. I told myself a million things. Anything to drown out the one truth I wasn't ready to face. That I wanted him. Not as a sister should. Not in a way I could ever explain, ever justify. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure if he felt it too. I started paying attention after that. To the way he spoke to me. To the way his eyes lingered a second too long. To the way he touched my shoulder lightly when he passed by, so brief, so innocent, yet I felt it everywhere. I started questioning everything. Was I imagining it? Was he just affectionate? Just comfortable around me because I was his sister? Or was there something else there? I didn't know. And maybe that was the most dangerous part. Because the uncertainty kept me trapped in my own mind, analyzing every detail, every moment, every single interaction until I didn't know what was real and what was just my own longing twisting reality. And then, there was my husband. The man who was supposed to notice me. The man who was supposed to be the one I thought about late at night, the one who made my stomach flutter, who made me feel like I mattered. But he didn't notice anything. Not the way my conversations with my brother lasted just a little too long. Not the way my voice softened when I spoke to him. Not the way I started paying more attention to how I looked. I didn't even realize I was doing it at first. But one day, I caught myself standing in front of the mirror, tilting my head, applying lipstick carefully, smoothing down my dress before walking into the living room where my brother was. And I froze. Because I never did that for my husband. Not anymore. And the realization hit me like a punch to the chest. I wasn't dressing for my husband. I was dressing for him. Guilt clawed at me, but it wasn't enough to stop me. Because every time I thought about pulling away, every time I told myself I needed to distance myself before it was too late, he would smile at me. Or he would say something that made me laugh, something that made me feel like he actually saw me. And suddenly, the guilt didn't matter so much. Because what harm was there in talking? In laughing? In feeling good, for once? It wasn't like I was doing anything wrong. Not really. Not yet. And so I let it continue. The late-night conversations in the kitchen, standing just a little too close. The inside jokes, the playful teasing, the stolen glances that made my heart pound in ways I tried to ignore. The small touches that meant nothing. That meant everything. I wanted to believe I was imagining it. That he was just my brother. That I was twisting something innocent into something it wasn't. But then, there were the moments that I couldn't explain away. The way his expression shifted when I walked into a room, like he had been waiting for me. The way he hesitated sometimes before speaking, like he was carefully choosing his words, afraid to say too much. The way his fingers brushed against mine one night when he handed me a glass of wine too long, too deliberate. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. And in those moments, I knew. I wasn't imagining it. He felt it too. And that terrified me. Because if he felt it, that meant this wasn't just in my head. That meant it was real. And real things? They had consequences. I started avoiding him. Or at least, I tried. I told myself I needed space, that I needed to stop this before it became something I couldn't undo. But the distance only made it worse. Because the more I pulled away, the more he seemed to notice. "Are you okay?" he asked me one night. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't look convinced. And then he said it. Did I do something wrong? And my heart cracked open because I wanted to say, "No, you did everything right." But I couldn't. So I just shook my head, forced a smile, and said, "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. And we both knew it. Because when he looked at me that night, really looked at me, I saw it. The same conflict. The same hesitation. The same impossible pull. And it was in that moment that I knew. This wasn't just a passing thought. This wasn't something that would go away on its own. This was something that would demand a choice. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to make the right one. Or if, deep down, I even wanted to. I should have known that something would happen eventually. That we couldn't keep dancing around whatever this was forever. Because the thing about temptation? It doesn't knock on your door politely. It creeps in slowly, like smoke under a locked door. And by the time you realize it's there, it's already inside you. Already filling your lungs. Already making it impossible to breathe without it. It happened on a Sunday. The house was quiet, my husband had left early for work as always. He barely said goodbye. I barely noticed. It was just me and my brother. We were supposed to go grocery shopping. Something simple. Something normal. We just sat there, both staring out the windshield, both pretending like we weren't aware of how close we were. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said it. You know, I've always admired you. I turned to him, startled. What do you mean? His jaw tightened, like he was debating whether to keep going. Then, finally, he said, you were always the strong one. The one who held everything together. When I was younger, I thought you were invincible. He laughed softly, shaking his head. And now, I just think you're the most incredible person I know. I should have laughed it off. I should have said something, that's sweet of you, or don't be ridiculous. But I didn't. Because his words wrapped around something deep inside me, something neglected, something starved. And for a second, just a second, I let myself believe him. The car was quiet again. The only sound was the slow, steady rhythm of our breathing. And then, before I even realized what I was doing, I reached for his hand. It was instinct. Reflex. A simple movement. But the moment my fingers touched his, everything shifted. Because he didn't pull away. And neither did I. We just sat there, holding on to something we shouldn't have been holding on to. And I could feel my pulse in my throat. The warmth of his skin against mine. The unbearable silence stretching between us, thick with something unspoken. Something undeniable. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds. Minutes. A lifetime. Then slowly, deliberately, I pulled my hand away. Because reality crashed over me all at once. What were we doing? What was I doing? This was my brother. This was wrong. Wasn't it? I cleared my throat, forcing a laugh that sounded as hollow as I felt. We should probably head back. He didn't argue. But as he put the car in drive, I saw the way his knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. Like he was holding something back. Like he wanted to say something. Like he wanted to do something. And I was terrified. Because a part of me wanted him to. That night, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I stood there, staring at my reflection, searching for something, anything, that made me feel like the person I used to be. But I didn't recognize her anymore. Because that woman wouldn't have let her brother hold her hand in the dark. She wouldn't have wanted it. But I had. And now, I couldn't pretend otherwise. I told myself it was nothing. That it was just a moment of weakness. That it wouldn't happen again. But I knew better. Because when something feels that good, that right, you don't just walk away from it. Even when you know you should. I told myself I was in control. That I could stop this. That nothing had happened. That nothing would happen. But control is a funny thing. You think you have it, right up until the moment you lose it completely. And that moment? That night? That was the night I crossed the point of no return. It started with an argument. Not with him. With my husband. Not that it mattered. At this point, everything with him felt like a fight. Or worse, like nothing at all. Because when he looked at me, it wasn't with anger or frustration. It was with indifference. Like I wasn't even worth arguing with anymore. Like I wasn't there. I'm working late again. His voice was clipped, uninterested, as he buttoned his shirt, barely glancing at me. Again. I didn't even try to hide the exhaustion in my voice. I don't have a choice. I laughed. A short, bitter sound. You always have a choice. That made him pause, just for a second. And then, without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door. Didn't kiss me. Didn't look back. Just gone. Like always. Like I wasn't even worth a second glance. I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of every moment of loneliness settle over me like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. But more than anything, I wanted to feel something. Anything. And then I heard a voice behind me. Are you okay? I turned. And there he was. My younger brother. The only person in this house who ever actually saw me. I should have walked away. I should have said I was fine. But instead, I let myself unravel in front of him. I let him see me, not the wife, not the woman who had spent years pretending to be okay. Just me. And God help me, he looked at me like I was enough. Like I had never stopped being enough. Come outside with me, he said suddenly. You need fresh air. I hesitated. I don't think, please. His voice was quiet. Just for a little while. And I should have said no. But I didn't. Because I didn't want to be alone tonight. So, I followed him. The night air was crisp, the kind that made everything feel sharper, clearer. We sat on the porch steps, neither of us speaking at first. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was waiting. And then, he spoke. I don't like seeing you like this. I let out a shaky breath. I don't like being like this. He was quiet for a long time. And then, softly, almost too softly, I heard him say, he doesn't deserve you. I turned to him, startled. Don't say that. Why not? His voice was steady. It's the truth. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that my marriage was complicated, that things weren't that simple. But then I saw the way he was looking at me. Not like a brother. Not anymore. And that was the moment. That was the moment the last thread of resistance inside me snapped. Because I had spent so long convincing myself that I was unloved. Unwanted. Invisible. But in his eyes, I wasn't invisible at all. And then, before I could stop myself, before I could think, I reached for him. The moment our fingers touched, I knew. This was it. The point where I could still walk away. Still fix this. Still pretend this was just loneliness, just a fleeting moment of weakness. But I didn't let go. And neither did he. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. All I know is that 1 second, we were staring at each other, breathing too fast, hearts pounding too hard, and the next, I was in his arms. It wasn't just a hug. It wasn't just anything. It was a collision. Years of longing, of distance, of buried emotions crashing into each other all at once. I felt his hands gripping my back, pulling me in like he was afraid to let go. I felt my fingers tangled in his shirt, holding on too tightly. And then his forehead was against mine, and I could feel his breath, warm and unsteady. We were so close. Too close. And I should have pulled away. But God help me. I wanted him to kiss me. I needed him to. But right before it happened, right before the last boundary shattered, I came back to myself. I jerked back, breathless, my pulse hammering so loud I could barely think. No, I whispered. I wasn't even sure who I was talking to, him or myself. His hands dropped from my waist like they had been burned. He looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt, confusion, and something else. Something dangerous. Something that made my whole body ache. I'm sorry, he said, his voice raw. I shook my head, stepping back. We can't, but I couldn't finish the sentence. Because the truth was, I didn't want to say we couldn't. I wanted to say we shouldn't. And that was even worse. Because it meant that deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying the moment over and over again in my head, feeling the heat of his hands, the press of his body against mine, the way he had looked at me. And every time I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. I knew I was lying. Because the problem with crossing a line is that once you do, it's almost impossible not to cross it again. I woke up the next morning and everything was different. Not outwardly. Not in any way someone else would notice. But inside me, inside us, something had shifted. And there was no undoing it. I avoided him. It wasn't intentional at first. It was instinct. The moment I stepped out of my bedroom that morning and saw him in the kitchen, his back turned, stirring his coffee like nothing had changed, I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard, I thought I might be sick. Because I knew the moment he turned around and looked at me, I'd see it. I'd see the memory of last night. Of what almost happened. Of what had happened. And I wasn't ready for that. So I turned around and walked back into my room. Like a coward. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence. We didn't talk. Not really. Just the necessary words, the surface-level interactions. Pass the salt. Are you using the car today? Thanks. But the air between us was thick, crackling with unspoken things. And every time I caught his eyes on me, Just for a second, just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Like the walls were closing in. Like if I didn't do something soon, I was going to break. My husband noticed. Not in the way I feared, not in the way that would have led to questions I couldn't answer, but in his own way. He watched me more closely that night at dinner. Not with suspicion. With confusion. "You okay?" he asked suddenly, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He studied me for a second longer. And then, just like that, he let it go. Just like he always did. And that should have made me feel relieved. But instead, it just made me angry. Because the man who was supposed to know me better than anyone didn't see me at all. And the man who wasn't supposed to notice me saw everything. Days passed. The tension didn't fade. If anything, it got worse. I started avoiding him even more, taking longer routes through the house just to avoid walking past him, lingering in my car before coming inside, pretending to be busy when he was in the room. But he didn't make it easy. He wasn't avoiding me. If anything, it felt like he was waiting. Waiting for me to crack. Waiting for me to stop pretending that nothing had changed. And then, one night, I did. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Everyone else had gone to bed. Or at least, I thought they had. Because suddenly, I felt him. Standing behind me. Not touching me. Not saying a word. Just there. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the counter. "You're avoiding me." His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight in it. I swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." A sharp exhale. A quiet laugh that held no humor. "You do." Silence stretched between us. And then, "I need to know." My throat went dry. "Know what?" He hesitated. And then, when he spoke again, his voice was lower. Rougher. If it was just me. I turned around too fast. Too suddenly. And we were too close. Too close for this to still be something we could explain away. His eyes searched mine, waiting. And for the first time in days, I let myself look at him. Really look at him. At the way his jaw clenched. At the way his hands curled into fists like he was trying to hold himself back. At the way his lips parted, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. And in that moment, I could have lied. I should have lied. I should have told him it was nothing. That I didn't feel it. That it had just been a mistake, a moment of weakness, and we needed to forget it ever happened. But I didn't. Because it wasn't just him. It was me. And he knew it. We both did. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The air between us was too thick. And I could feel it happening again. That slow pull. That inevitability. Like gravity itself was working against us. And God help me. I wasn't sure I had the strength to fight it. But then, footsteps. Somewhere down the hall. A door creaking open. And just like that, the spell was broken. I stumbled back. He turned away. And everything we almost said vanished. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing so hard I thought it might break free from my chest. Because I had spent so long telling myself that what happened before was a mistake. That we could move past it. That it wouldn't happen again. But now? Now I knew the truth. This wasn't going away. This thing between us, whatever it was, whatever it had become, it was only getting stronger. And if I wasn't careful, if we weren't careful, we were going to destroy everything. I told myself I could fix this. That if I just kept my distance, if I ignored the way my heart reacted to him, if I pushed it all down far enough, eventually it would go away. That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? You make a mistake. You recognize it. And then you course correct before it turns into something you can't undo. But what if? What if the mistake isn't the moment? What if the mistake is wanting the moment? Because that was my real sin. Not what had happened. But the fact that I didn't want it to stop. The fact that I still wanted him. I couldn't sleep. Every night I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts running in circles. Should I tell my husband? Would that be the right thing to do? Would it cleanse me? Or would it only destroy everything? Would it make things better? Or would it only make me feel better, at the cost of everyone else? Because that was the truth. If I told him, it wouldn't be for him. It would be for me. To ease my guilt. To shift the weight of my secret onto his shoulders instead of mine. And wasn't that just as selfish? Wasn't it worse? I ran through every scenario in my head. If I told him, what would he do? Would he yell? Would he cry? Would he finally see me? Would he fight for me? Or would he just walk away? Would he let me go as easily as he had let everything else slip between us? I didn't know which answer I feared more. And then there was my brother. What was I supposed to do about him? Pretend he didn't exist? Pretend we hadn't felt what we felt? Pretend I hadn't reached for him first? That I hadn't let it happen? How was I supposed to erase him when he was right there? When he was the only one who had made me feel alive in longer than I cared to admit? Was I supposed to cut him out of my life completely? Could I? And, even if I could, would I even want to? The worst part wasn't the guilt. It was the longing. Because even as my conscience screamed at me, even as I told myself over and over again that this was wrong, that I needed to stop, I still missed him. I missed his voice. I missed the way he looked at me. I missed the way he made me feel real again. And that was the most unforgivable part of all. I tried. I really did. I tried to be the wife my husband deserved. I made his favorite meals. I asked about his day. I even reached for him at night, hoping, praying that maybe, just maybe, he would sense the desperation in me, the silent plea for him to remind me why I had chosen this life, why I had chosen him. But he didn't. He just turned over, muttered something about being tired, and went to sleep. And I lay there beside him, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling my heart crack open. Because I knew then. I knew what I had been trying so hard to deny. It wasn't just that my marriage was falling apart. It was that I had already let it go. And I wasn't sure I wanted it back. So what now? What was left? Did I keep pretending? Did I force myself to live in this lie until I forgot the taste of something more? Or did I give in? Did I let myself fall completely, knowing full well that once I did, there was no climbing back out? I didn't know. I still don't know. But what I do know is that the moment I stopped fighting it, the moment I let go, was the moment everything truly fell apart. So now I ask you, what would you have done? Have you ever been in a situation where emotions blurred the lines of right and wrong? Where your heart wanted something your mind knew it shouldn't? Because I spent so long convincing myself that I was strong enough, that I was in control, that I could want something and never act on it. But I was wrong. Wanting is acting. Because once you want something, once you let yourself crave it, the damage is already done. So tell me, should I have told my husband? Should I have walked away the moment I felt that first spark? Should I have distanced myself earlier, before the lines blurred, before the feelings grew too big to contain? Would it have even made a difference? Or was this always going to happen, no matter how hard I tried to stop it? Let me know in the comments. I need to hear what you think. Because even now, after everything, I still don't have the answers. And maybe I never will. But I do know this. Loneliness is dangerous. It sneaks up on you. It settles in your bones so slowly, you don't even realize how deep it's gotten. And when you finally do, when you finally wake up and feel the emptiness surrounding you, you'll do anything to fill it. Even if it means reaching for something you shouldn't. Even if it means breaking something you can't put back together. Because some mistakes don't just go away. They follow you. They become you. And the hardest part isn't what you did. It's living with it afterward. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: don't let yourself get to the point where you're so empty that you start looking for love in the wrong places. Because once you do, once you cross that line, you'll never be the same again. Every time I see my younger brother, I wonder, does he regret it too? Or is he just better at pretending? If you want more jaw-dropping real-life stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because trust me, this is just the beginning.